Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your support keeps stories like this coming. Have you ever sat across from someone who once promised to cherish you, only to realize they are laughing at your expense? That they never really saw you. That behind their smirk lies a world of underestimation, and behind your silence, a world they could never comprehend. My name is Elena Ross. And this is not just a story of betrayal. It is a reckoning, built one silent moment at a time. That winter evening in Chicago was the beginning of the end for Daniel Walsh. He just did not know it yet. We were at the Sky Vault, a rooftop dining club frequented by the city's elite. Twinkling lights above, crystal chandeliers reflecting softly across the wine glasses. A 12-seat table had been set for a strategic dinner Daniel had been planning for weeks. Seated were key executives from Anderson Holdings, his firm's largest and most lucrative client. 70% of Walsh and Carter's annual revenue came from Anderson's portfolio. Tonight was supposed to seal a 5-year renewal. Instead, Daniel would unknowingly light the match to burn down everything. As always, I arrived beside him, his accessory. Not his partner. I wore the silver dress he liked, the one he once said made me look elegantly unthreatening. I smiled politely, held my wine just so, and greeted everyone with grace. I knew my role. But tonight, that role was about to expire. Deanna Liu, the CFO of Anderson Holdings, hugged me warmly. Looking radiant, Elena, she said, her eyes gleaming with something only I could read, knowledge. She had been my confidant for years, through board meetings and acquisitions, through strategies whispered behind screens. But tonight, she was playing along. Just like I was. Daniel, already 2 glasses of wine in, cleared his throat and stood. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice rising above the low hum of conversation, thank you for joining us this evening. As you know, Anderson Holdings and Walsh and Carter have shared a fruitful relationship for over a decade. And I am here to ensure that continues. There were smiles and nods around the table. Eric Bowman, another power player in the room and a longtime friend of mine, raised his glass. I held my breath. Daniel turned toward me with the theatrical charm of a man too proud of his own voice. Of course, none of this would be possible without my beautiful wife Elena, he said. The woman who keeps the house warm, the parties flowing, and the stress at bay. The table chuckled. My fingers tightened slightly around my glass. I kept my expression soft. We were only beginning. You know, Daniel continued, Elena once asked me if she should take a finance course online. I told her, darling, some people are meant for the boardroom, and some are meant for the living room. The laughter was louder this time. I saw Diana's jaw tighten. Eric's smile faded. But no one spoke up. Why would they? To them, I was just a wife. Daniel laughed harder, placing his hand over mine as if to soften the blow. No offense, sweetheart. But let's face it. If Elena were to run a company, she'd probably forget to collect the invoices. The room went quiet for half a beat. I looked across the table, meeting eyes with every executive I had worked with over the past 8 years, under a different name. Quiet nods. Suppressed smirks. They were waiting for my move. But I still had hours to play my part. Dinner continued. Courses came and went. Daniel talked about market shifts, potential mergers, the need for bold leadership in uncertain times. He was animated, confident, and completely unaware that the foundation beneath his company had already been sold, to me. 3 days earlier, Ross Capital Holdings, the firm I founded, nurtured, and kept hidden from Daniel, had finalized its acquisition of Anderson Holdings management contracts. The paperwork sat in my office, signed and sealed. But the public announcement would wait until tomorrow morning. Tonight was not about exposure. It was about letting Daniel bury himself deeper. After dessert, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his glass of scotch half full. "This is what success looks like," he said, gesturing around the room. "Strong men at the helm. Loyal clients. And wives who support from the sidelines." He raised his glass to me again. "To Elena. The most supportive, non-threatening partner a man could ask for." Everyone drank. I did too. Slowly. With poise. With purpose. At that moment, I felt no anger. Only precision. I was not here for revenge. I was here for restoration. For truth. For all the women who had been told to dim their light so someone else could shine. After dinner, as Daniel stumbled toward the valet, I held his arm. "Let me drive," I said gently. He smiled. "You're always so responsible." My rock. I guided him into the passenger seat, then slid behind the wheel. Instead of heading home, I turned onto Wacker Drive, guiding us into the underground garage of a sleek glass tower. Daniel stirred. "This isn't home." "I forgot something at the charity office," I lied. He mumbled and leaned against the window. Moments later, he was asleep. I parked in spot number 1. Marked reserved, eat Ross. He never saw it. The elevator recognized my fingerprint. 49th floor. Executive wing. My office. Deanna, Eric, and Malik Carter were already waiting. The lights were low. Documents in hand. Coffee cups half full. Energy crackling. I signed the final confirmation of transfer. Deanna smiled. "Tomorrow, Anderson Holdings goes public with the deal. Walsh and Carter will be left with nothing." Eric nodded. "This is your moment." I looked out at the city. Lights glittered below. And I thought of all the dinners, all the silences, all the rooms I had stood in as just a wife. No more. Tomorrow, Daniel would learn exactly what I had been building. And this was only the beginning. By the time the sun peeked through the skyline, casting a golden hue over the frozen streets of Chicago, I was already dressed in slate gray wool, seated behind my desk at Ross Capital Holdings. The building stirred with early energy. Assistants buzzing through corridors, analysts reviewing pre-market data, partners stepping into glass-walled conference rooms with coffee and urgency in hand. My nameplate gleamed beside my door. Elena Ross. Founder and Chief Executive Officer. Outside the tinted window, the city moved unaware. Inside this tower, though, the storm was gathering, calculated and deliberate. I checked my inbox. Deanna had sent a final press package to be released at 9 sharp. The lead headline, Ross Capital Holdings announces strategic acquisition of Anderson Holdings Group. A $1 billion deal that would sever the spine of Walsh and Carter's portfolio in one clean, public motion. It would also name me, officially, as the woman behind the firm that had slowly overtaken Daniel's client base for the past 5 years. My assistant knocked once, then opened the door. "Ms. Ross, Mr. Bowman is on line 1. Ms. Liu is confirming CNN and Bloomberg for later today." "Thank you," I said calmly. "Have the legal team prep statements for investor calls. And let security know not to admit Mr. Walsh if he shows up without an appointment." The young woman blinked, confused. "Your husband?" I offered the smallest smile. "Yes. That would be him." She left the door ajar. I picked up the phone. "Eric," I said. "Elena," he answered. "The media's ready. Our trading teams are prepared. Deanna just told me Daniel has not made any moves. No calls. No emails. Nothing. He still thinks Anderson is signing the renewal with Walsh and Carter today," I said. "He is going to be blindsided. That is the plan." At 8:57 a.m., I walked out of my office and into the trading floor. All heads turned. Screens glowed with graphs and flashing tickers. Our digital clocks counted down to the opening bell. "Let's make history," I said softly, taking my position beside Diana and Malik. At 9 a.m., precisely, the press release went live. Newsrooms lit up. Finance reporters flooded feeds. Phones buzzed. And within 2 minutes, Walsh and Carter's stock ticker plunged 15%. By 9:06, it was down 38. Inside the chaos of our own floor, there was only focused silence. A reverent buzz of power and satisfaction. No celebration yet. We were professionals. But everyone in that room knew what this meant. Daniel's firm would not survive this. I returned to my office as the phones began to ring in waves. Congratulations from investors. Requests for interviews. Inquiries from smaller firms looking for rescue deals. I answered none of them yet. At 9:21 a.m., my personal phone rang. It was Daniel. I let it ring to voicemail. A minute later, a text appeared. "Daniel, Elena. I can't reach Anderson. Their phones are off. Something's wrong. Call me." Another ring. Another ignored. At 9:30, his number was blocked from every internal line of Ross Capital Holdings. I needed no interruptions. I needed only clarity. And clarity came in the form of a breaking news banner on every financial screen in America. Ross Capital Holdings, led by founder and CEO Elena Ross, announces exclusive acquisition of Anderson Holdings Group. Walsh and Carter expected to lose 70% of client revenue. Industry shaken. It was happening. And it was irreversible. Downstairs, Daniel was pacing his office, likely shouting at assistants, demanding answers, screaming at a world he no longer understood. The world had shifted. And his wife, the woman he believed to be decorative, disposable, and domesticated, was now sitting at the head of the table he had always tried to keep her from. At 10:04 a.m., my assistant returned. "He's on his way up," she said, voice tight. He passed through security before they received the update. "Let him in," I said, standing. "But give me 5 minutes alone before legal joins." She nodded and stepped out. I smoothed the front of my blazer, adjusted the pendant at my neck, and took my place behind my desk. The door opened without a knock. Daniel entered, wild-eyed, disheveled, pale from disbelief and fury. "Elena," he said, voice trembling. "Tell me this isn't real. Tell me this is some kind of mistake." "It's real," I replied. "And it's not a mistake." He stared at me, blinking hard. "You did this. I led it. I built it. I signed it." "You," he choked. "But how? You've never even..." "Never even what?" I asked, voice still calm. "Sat in a boardroom. Advised a client. Launched an acquisition." "You mean I've never told you I was doing those things?" He stumbled back a step. "Why would you hide this?" "I didn't hide," I said. "You just never looked." He sank into the visitor's chair, disbelief thick on his face. "You used our marriage to get close to my clients." "No," I said. "I used your blindness to get close to their needs. They came to me, Daniel. They came to me because I listened. Because I solved problems. Because while you dismissed me, I delivered results." "This will ruin me," he whispered. "You ruined yourself," I answered. "I just cleaned up the debris." The door opened again. Deanna stepped in, followed by Malik. They stood beside me like pillars of steel. Daniel stood, fists clenched. You think you can take everything from me and walk away the hero? No, I said. I walked away from the need to be a hero the day you told me I was unqualified to understand business. That I was meant for dinner parties and flower arrangements. I walked around the desk slowly, each step deliberate. Now I am not your flower. I am your fire. He looked from me to Diana, to Malik, to the sleek office glowing with quiet dominance. And in that moment, he knew. This was not his world anymore. It never was. He had just been renting space in mine. The elevator doors closed behind Daniel with a thud that felt final. He had not spoken another word. His last glance had been a mixture of disbelief, panic, and something else, realization. That perhaps everything he thought he owned, everything he thought he built, had stood on borrowed ground. My ground. The moment the floor was clear, I turned to Diana and Malik. Let legal prepare a full transition statement for Anderson Holdings, I said. Daniel will try to dispute ownership. He'll fail. But I want every safeguard in place. Malik nodded. Already drafted. Filed under corporate consolidation statutes. He cannot challenge without contradicting his own non-disclosure sign-offs from 4 years ago. Diana, ever calm, added, the Financial Oversight Board is already reviewing the shift. Public reaction is positive. You will be hearing from Forbes and The Atlantic this afternoon. I inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. 8 years of silence had led here, to a single morning that would rewrite an entire industry's perception. When the doors shut again, I returned to my office, locking the door behind me. I walked to the window, the same one I had stood before when I first signed Ross Capital's inaugural funding agreement. Back then, it had been a humble floor in a shared workspace. No assistants. No trading desks. Just a name, my mother's, and an idea. That power did not always need to roar. Sometimes, it only needed to endure. I had endured Daniel's narrative of who I was for almost a decade. The narrative where I was a trophy, a hostess, an accessory to his empire. He never knew that the empire was mine. In those early years, I remember watching him from the sidelines at corporate events. Watching him talk over women in meetings. Watching him dismiss junior analysts who spoke up. Watching him take calls during our anniversary dinner, yet reprimand me for being too distracted, if I even mentioned market trends. When I launched Ross Capital under my mother's maiden name, I did so intentionally, not to deceive, but to create space. A space where my work could breathe without being reduced to his perception. And slowly, quietly, I began building the foundation beneath his feet. The first acquisition was small, a logistics firm in the South. Then a struggling fintech startup with undervalued assets. Then, after Diana joined as my CFO, we made our first major move, buying into a distribution chain that was one of Walsh & Carter's key vendors. Each deal was masked through shell networks, legal shields, and third-party portfolios. Not illegal. Just invisible. By year 5, Ross Capital controlled 3 of Daniel's 6 biggest supply partners. By year 6, our growth rate had tripled his. He still did not see me. Not even when Diana appeared at one of our dinner parties. He greeted her politely, poured her wine, and said, "I've heard of your firm. Supposedly run by some ghost CEO. Must be a man with a name like Ross." Diana nearly choked on her drink. I smiled politely. He saw what he wanted to see. And it was that blindness that let me keep going, unseen and uninterrupted. By the time Anderson Holdings approached us for a merger conversation, I knew the moment was near. Their board was divided. Half wanted innovation. Half clung to Daniel's tradition. But all of them were growing restless with his complacency. That was when I offered them something more than capital. I offered them vision. Anderson's acquisition had been negotiated over 6 months, signed in the 11th hour, and timed perfectly for this week, when Walsh and Carter's quarterly numbers would force them into renewal desperation. I hadn't needed to destroy Daniel. He had done that himself. I simply gave gravity permission to finish the fall. My phone buzzed. A message from my assistant. CNBC interview confirmed at 2 o'clock. CNN requesting exclusive later this week. PR team has approved the official CEO reveal, ***. Another message came in. From Eric Bowman. Well done, Elena. The boardroom belongs to you now. And the narrative is yours to write. Narrative. That word lingered. Daniel had spent years writing mine for me. Telling friends, colleagues, even strangers who I was. What I wanted. What I lacked. How I should behave. And I had let him. Because I was busy building something real. I walked to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a journal. Leather-bound. Black. Worn from travel. Inside were pages upon pages of notes, timelines, deal structures, diagrams, my blueprints. I flipped to the first page. Ross Capital Holdings, Day 1. I had written, ***, he thinks I've paused my career. He thinks I've stepped back. He has no idea I'm already moving forward. Quietly. Ruthlessly. Patiently, ***. The foundation beneath his feet had always been mine. He just never cared to ask where it came from. At 11 a.m., the markets reflected the truth. Walsh and Carter's stock had fallen below their critical threshold. Emergency holds were in place. Investors were panicking. Analysts were dissecting the merger live on national television. And through it all, I sat in my office, silent. Resolute. Watching the ripples of 8 years spread outward like shockwaves. Then came the knock. Not Daniel. Not press. It was my assistant again. Someone from the Tribune is here, she said, asking if the woman who built an empire in silence will be giving a statement today. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and nodded. Yes, I said. I believe she will. The conference room felt unusually still despite the quiet hum of the city pulsing beyond its towering glass windows. 2 cameras were positioned at a respectful distance. A slender boom mic dangled above the oval table. A single chair sat across from me, empty for the moment, while my team waited outside with an air of nervous anticipation. At precisely 12 minutes past noon, the door opened and in walked Maren Hollis, senior editor for the Chicago Tribune, a woman known for asking questions that left billionaires breathless and senators off script. She wore a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her notepad tucked under her arm like a sword. Elena Ross, she said with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You've had a busy morning. I'm used to long days, I replied, standing to shake her hand. I imagine you are, she said as she Saturday, the world just found out that one of Chicago's most prominent investment firms was built in complete silence, led by a woman the industry thought was retired, and married to a man now facing financial ruin. You have to admit, it's the kind of story that writes itself. Only if you're the one holding the pen, I said calmly. She smiled again, this time more genuine. The camera light blinked red. We began. Maren Hollis here, for the Chicago Tribune, she said. We're sitting down with Elena Ross, the founder and CEO of Ross Capital Holdings, whose acquisition of Anderson Holdings this morning has sent tremors across the financial sector. Elena, thank you for joining us. Thank you for having me. Maren flipped a page in her notes. Let's start simple. Why now? Because he mocked me in front of men who work for me. Because I'm done being quiet. Because this moment was never his. Because the conditions were right, I answered smoothly. Market indicators aligned. Our growth reached the threshold we'd been targeting. Timing is everything in this business. You've operated in complete secrecy for nearly 8 years. Why? I didn't operate in secrecy, I said. I operated without permission. That line landed. Marin blinked once, then nodded. What does that mean? It means that if I had asked the world whether I could build this, I'd still be waiting for approval. She tilted her head. So you didn't tell your husband? Some are calling it a betrayal. I call it restraint. Marin didn't press. She flipped to the next question. Ross Capital has quietly acquired or absorbed over a dozen companies in the past 3 years. That includes firms your husband's company depended on. Was this revenge? I looked her in the eye. It was a correction. She let the pause stretch, letting the answer breathe. Let's talk about power, she said. You've had it for a while. Why pretend not to? I never pretended, I said. I simply didn't advertise. There's a difference. Outside the room, I could see Diana and Malik watching through the glass. Calm, focused. This was a moment we had crafted for years. But it was not for gloating. It was a declaration. Marin asked, when you hosted charity galas, were those business meetings? They were both, I said. In those rooms, we raised money for causes and formed partnerships that moved billions. But only one side of that was ever recognized. Because people like Daniel believed women could either be generous or powerful, not both. She leaned in slightly. What do you say to the people who now see you as a symbol? A kind of corporate justice figure. I say I'm not a symbol. I'm an executive who did her job exceptionally well. I shouldn't be the exception. I should be one of many. Your husband is being investigated now, she said softly. Insider information. Falsified renewal reports. Fabricated revenue projections. Did you know? I suspected, I said. But I wanted my actions to be about growth, not destruction. What happens next is in the hands of regulators. Marin nodded slowly, then set her notepad down. One final question, Elena. I waited. If Daniel had seen you clearly from the start, as an equal, as a partner, would any of this have happened? I took a breath. If he had seen me, I said quietly, he would have been standing beside me today. Not watching from the shadows of his own collapse. The room was still. The red light blinked off. That was remarkable, she whispered. The industry needed this story. No, I said, rising. The women in it did. As I exited the room, Marin stayed behind, scribbling furiously in her notes. My team greeted me with proud, measured nods. But there was no applause, no champagne, no smugness. Only purpose. Because we were not done. That interview would air by sundown. It would trend within the hour. Investors would react. Daniel would too. And tomorrow, I would give another. This time at Harvard Business School. But for now, there was one more thing I needed to do. I walked back into my office, sat at my desk, and opened a locked drawer. Inside was the original ring box from my wedding day. I opened it. The diamond was still there. So was the receipt. I closed it gently, stood, and placed it in a sealed envelope marked Final Return. Then I sent it to Daniel's office with a note written in my own handwriting. You build your house on a foundation you never checked. It cracked the day you told me I didn't belong in it. The box arrived at Daniel's office just past 4 p.m. The receptionist hesitated before placing it on his desk. His assistant, still recovering from the morning's chaos, barely met his eyes as she delivered it. Daniel opened the envelope with the last fragments of composure he still possessed, expecting anything but what he found inside. A velvet ring box. Inside, the diamond from our engagement, flawless, cold, unchanged. And beside it, a small folded note in my handwriting. You build your house on a foundation you never checked. It cracked the day you told me I didn't belong in it. Daniel stared at it for a long time, hands trembling. He was alone. His executive team had all but disappeared since the stock freeze. Anderson Holdings had confirmed the transfer to Ross Capital in a statement that read like a eulogy for Walsh and Carter. His calls went unanswered. His legal counsel withdrew representation citing conflict of interest. Several of their partners had quietly invested in Ross Capital months ago. The silence surrounding him was deafening. But not unfamiliar. Daniel had always lived in echo chambers of his own making. He preferred those who agreed, applauded, submitted. He confused power with volume, presence with dominance. And in doing so, he made the fatal mistake of never listening. He read my note again. Then again. Then he threw the box across the room, shattering the crystal whiskey decanter beside the bar cart. Amber liquid spilled across hardwood floors as shards of glass sparkled in the winter light. He slumped back in his leather chair, the one he once boasted was designed for men who made real decisions. But no decisions were left for him now. That same afternoon, the Chicago Tribune released a special edition with the headline in bold black serif. The Wife Who Built the Empire. Beneath it, a full-page image of me seated in Ross Capital's boardroom, poised, deliberate, eyes steady on the horizon. The interview played across news channels by sundown. My words echoed into homes, offices, phones. The response was swift. Women in finance began reposting clips, quoting my lines. Business schools requested appearances. Boards started adding clauses about inclusion and transparency. The narrative Daniel once controlled had been seized, reshaped, rewritten. And Daniel? He became a cautionary tale. The man who mocked his wife in front of clients and lost them all to her. The man who never noticed the floor beneath him was shifting. At 7:30 p.m., he sat in darkness, the newsroom commentary bleeding through his office television. He had not spoken to anyone in hours. His inbox was filled with withdrawal notices, contract terminations, and press inquiries that no longer praised but questioned, who had really been in charge at Walsh and Carter? Who signed the audits? Who approved the falsified reports? His empire was crumbling not because I destroyed it, but because it had never been built properly to begin with. I had only peeled back the curtain. Meanwhile, across the city, I sat in my home study, laptop open, reading the final legal handover documents. Deanna was on a secure call confirming the asset shifts. Malik was drafting the press statement that would announce Walsh and Carter's full collapse. I paused, fingers resting on the keyboard. Then, without hesitation, I typed the closing line of the announcement myself. Ross Capital Holdings welcomes the opportunity to build on what others took for granted. The message was scheduled to publish the next morning. As I closed the laptop, I thought of the first time Daniel made me feel small in public. A client dinner. My first as his wife. I had tried to contribute to a conversation about foreign investment trends, referencing a report I'd studied in graduate school. He had laughed. Elena's brilliant, he had said. At choosing the best cheese pairings. You should let her host your next party. Laughter around the table. Silence in my chest. It had begun there. A single crack in the foundation. Invisible. Silent. But cracks grow. Under weight. Under ignorance. Under arrogance. And today, the entire house had collapsed. Back in his office, Daniel finally stood. He walked slowly to the shattered ring box, picked it up with trembling fingers, and sat back down. He turned the diamond in his hand, staring at its cold brilliance. He whispered to no one, "I didn't know." And that was the truth. He never knew. Because he never asked. Because he never thought I could. And now, the world did. At 8:12 p.m., I received a message from Diana. "He's been served. SEC audit initiated. You were right. He falsified projections on the last 2 quarters. They'll eat him alive." I didn't reply. I just opened the wine I had been saving for this night. Not to celebrate his fall, but to mark my rise, the kind that doesn't come with applause, but with acknowledgement. Because I had never wanted revenge. I wanted recognition. And now, the world had no choice but to see what had been standing quietly beside it all along. Power in plain sight. The news broke before sunrise. Every major outlet, Bloomberg, CNN, Financial Post, and the Wall Street Journal, led with the same core headline, repeated in variations. Montgomery Empire falls, SEC investigation confirms fraud allegations at Walsh & Carter. Within the first 30 minutes of market opening, Walsh & Carter's stock was delisted. By noon, former partners had issued public statements cutting ties, investors were demanding restitution, and the firm's offices in New York and San Francisco had gone dark. But it was the internal leak that delivered the final blow. Screenshots of internal emails surfaced, showing Daniel's team backdating earnings reports, inflating client activity, and aggressively pushing false projections ahead of quarterly briefings, all in a desperate attempt to mask the hemorrhaging of clients to Ross Capital. One of the leaked exchanges read, "We can't let the board know we've lost Anderson. Hold the numbers steady. We'll adjust once Walsh resecures the deal." The date on that email. 4 days before the Anderson acquisition became public. It confirmed everything. By the time Daniel's name appeared on the Department of Financial Oversight's inquiry list, the damage was already irreparable. His reputation, once built on bold moves and loud confidence, had unraveled thread by thread, until nothing remained but a man backed into a corner he had carved himself. That morning, I sat quietly in my office, the city stretching endlessly beneath me, my team gathered around the central table reviewing the schedule for the next 48 hours. There was no celebration. No glasses raised. Just motion. Purpose. Calm efficiency. "Harvard Business School has confirmed the keynote," said Diana. "They're titling the session, 'The CEO Who Built While Dismissed.'" I nodded. Let's keep the focus on strategy. This was never personal. Malik looked up. But the world sees it that way. "They'll catch up," I said. At 11:13 a.m., my assistant stepped in holding a sleek white envelope. "This just arrived from Walsh & Carter," she said hesitantly. "Marked personal. Hand-delivered." I took it, waved her off gently, and opened the flap. Inside was a single page. "I have officially resigned from the board and stepped down from the company. You win. I hope that means something to you. Daniel ****. I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly, placed it in the drawer, and slid it shut. It did mean something. But not what he thought. This was never about winning. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine, the right to be seen, to be heard, to lead. At 1:20 p.m., Daniel appeared on the steps of his former office building, flanked by reporters, security detail, and a silence that said everything. He looked gaunt. 10 years older. His suit hung loose on his frame. For the first time in his career, he had no prepared speech, no entourage to polish his image, no firm to protect him. One reporter shouted, "Mr. Walsh, do you regret how you treated your wife?" He paused only for a second before muttering, "I didn't know who she really was." Another voice fired back, "Is that the problem, or the point?" Cameras flashed. The next morning, his photo landed on the front of every finance section in the country. The man who ignored the future, until she bought his past. Back at Ross Capital, I met with Diana and Eric for a private review session. The fallout is stabilizing, Diana said. Your name is everywhere. Not just because of what you did, but how you did it. Eric added, even the SEC chair referenced you this morning. Said the industry should learn a lesson from Ross Capital's model of sustainable, transparent, and intentional growth. I closed the file in front of me. Let them take notes. But let's keep our focus forward. That afternoon, I addressed the entire company. Every floor tuned in via internal stream. I stood at the central atrium, lights soft, eyes steady on the faces of hundreds of people who had helped me get here without ever demanding the spotlight. You didn't just build a firm, I told them. You built a philosophy. That patience beats arrogance. That preparation defeats noise. That respect matters. And now the world is watching. So let's show them what leadership looks like, not just once, but every day. They stood. Applauded. Not for a spectacle, but for a story they had helped write. A new story. As I returned to my office, another envelope waited for me, this one sealed in gold, embossed with the crest of the International Leadership Forum. I opened it slowly. You have been named Global Executive of the Year. We would be honored by your presence at the keynote session in Geneva this fall. Your story has transcended markets. It has changed the way the world understands power. I stared at the words, heart steady. And I realized something Daniel never had. Real power doesn't scream. It listens. It builds. It waits. And when it arrives, it doesn't just shake the room. It changes the architecture forever. The auditorium at Harvard was packed. Rows of students in tailored blazers filled the seats, notebooks open, devices ready. Professors lined the walls, quietly anticipating. Journalists from Bloomberg, Fortune, and The Atlantic lingered near the exits, recording every flicker of the stage lights, every murmur of the crowd. The event had been oversubscribed within 30 minutes of announcement. Not because of the company I built, though that mattered. But because of what I represented to them now. The woman they thought they had missed. The leader who built the walls while they were watching the curtains. I stood backstage, calm as ever, while Diana handed me the polished note cards. I would not use them. They're going to expect a victory speech, she said softly. They won't get one, I replied. Because this wasn't about triumph. It was about transformation. The host appeared at the edge of the curtain, adjusting her earpiece. Ms. Ross, they're ready for you. I stepped forward, heels quiet on the polished floor, the spotlight blooming above me. The room went silent. Every eye turned toward me, not with skepticism or dismissal, but with expectation. With respect. I let the silence stretch just long enough to breathe. Then I spoke. 8 years ago, I attended a dinner party where I was told, in front of executives and colleagues, that I was just a wife. That my place was in the background. That my value was in my silence. Murmurs. Shifts in posture. Pens frozen mid-sentence. That night, I smiled. I nodded. I played the role expected of me. But what no one at that table knew was that I had spent the past 2 years building a firm in the shadows. A firm that, just weeks later, would secure its first 7-figure deal. That firm would grow. Quietly. Strategically. Until one morning, it would own every major client my husband's company relied on. Not as revenge. But as inevitability. The crowd was still. Wide-eyed. Listening. This story has been framed as one of revenge. But I didn't build Ross Capital to destroy someone else. I built it because I had something to say, and no one was listening. So I spoke in actions instead of words. I paused, allowing the message to settle. And when the world finally looked up, it wasn't because I shouted louder. It was because I had already moved the ceiling. A beat of silence. Then applause. But I raised one hand gently. I'm not here to be a symbol. I'm not here to be a headline. I'm here because this shouldn't be rare. Because too many voices are still dismissed before they speak. Too many women are still underestimated in boardrooms, still told their instincts are too soft, their strategies too emotional, their leadership too quiet. My voice stayed low. But unwavering. I'm not the only one. I was just one of the lucky few who decided not to wait for permission. From the back row, a student stood. Then another. And another. Until the entire hall rose to their feet. Not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. In recognition of something deeper than a success story. A paradigm shift. After the session, the Q&A flowed like a tide. Questions about structure, leadership, control. Young women lined up to speak to me, notebooks clutched, eyes burning with possibility. One student, perhaps 19, said quietly, "How did you know when it was time to reveal everything?" I smiled gently. When the world gave me no seat at the table, I said, I built the table. And when it was sturdy enough, I invited them all to sit. That night, back in my penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline, I watched the lights from the Ross Capitol building flicker like a constellation drawn by human hands. Daniel had not spoken publicly since his resignation. His lawyers were busy. His legacy was under review. But I didn't follow the headlines anymore. They no longer mattered. What mattered were the calls from boardrooms asking for my insight. The letters from young women saying, "You gave me permission." And the silence I now carried, not as a burden, but as a tool. Because when you've built in silence long enough, your presence speaks louder than any words. At 11:17 p.m., my phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. Elena. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I never saw you. I never tried. I was wrong. I hope someday you'll forgive me. I stared at the screen. The message was sincere. But late. I typed a single sentence in return. Some debts can't be paid in apologies. Then I put the phone down and walked to the window. The city glowed. And I stood there, not as someone who took back power, but as someone who had carried it all along. They just finally looked up and saw it. The boardroom in Geneva was not unlike those I'd grown accustomed to, understated opulence, walls lined with polished oak panels, floor-to-ceiling glass casting a panoramic view of Lake Geneva in the background. The chairs around the table belonged to titans of industry, venture capitalists, multinational CEOs, former heads of state. Every one of them had, at one point or another, underestimated someone like me. Not anymore. I had been invited to deliver the keynote address for the Global Executive Forum, a stage typically reserved for world leaders and Fortune 10 founders. But this year, they chose the woman they once never counted on. The one who had built an empire while being dismissed at dinner tables. I arrived with Diana and Malik. No entourage. No fanfare. Just purpose. Before the session began, an older gentleman, a Swiss banking chair with more years behind him than I had in business, approached me. "I must admit," he said, accent thick and voice deliberate, "I had no idea who you were until the Tribune article. I thought Ross Capital was founded by a man." "Most did," I replied, offering a polite nod. "But perception was part of the strategy." He chuckled. "I underestimated you." I met his eyes evenly. "That's why I succeeded." When it was time, I stood at the podium, notes folded and forgotten. I no longer needed to rehearse my truth. The most dangerous leader, I began, is not the one who announces herself loudly. It is the one you do not see coming. Because while others seek validation, she builds. And when she is ready, the world has no choice but to reckon with her presence. The crowd listened in rapt attention, not blinking, not moving. There was no bravado in my delivery. Just fact. Just presence. Invisibility was my currency. Not because I lacked value, but because I learned how to protect it. And when the time came, I spent it all on one morning. One moment. One message. I was never just a wife. I was a strategist. A founder. A force. When the session ended, there was no standing ovation. Instead, there was silence. A kind that meant reflection, not reaction. Later, Malik whispered to me as we left the hall, "You didn't just walk into their house. You rewrote the architecture." Back in Chicago, the city felt different now. The Ross Capitol building had become more than a headquarters. It was a symbol. Not of conquest, but of patience. Of preparation. Of unseen mastery finally surfacing. The press had begun calling me the quiet architect. It was fitting. Because the walls I had built were never for show. They were for shelter. For strategy. For strength. That week, we closed another merger, one that Daniel's firm had once courted and failed to land. The CEO who signed the papers, a sharp woman named Amelia Trent, looked at me during the contract exchange. "Your story changed how I saw myself," she said. "I was waiting for someone to invite me to the table. Now I'm buying the table." I smiled. "You're not the only one," I replied. Because across the country, stories like mine were becoming less rare. Quiet women were speaking louder. Loud women were being heard properly. And power was changing shape. That weekend, I visited my mother's old townhouse, the one she had worked 3 jobs to keep after my father left. I hadn't been back in years. The front door still creaked. The steps still held the same uneven dip near the second plank. I stood in my old bedroom, staring at the corkboard I had left behind, filled with quotes, blueprints, and the one headline I'd printed from a finance magazine as a teenager. "This industry belongs to the bold." I laughed quietly. They were right. But they forgot boldness could be quiet. Back at my penthouse, I poured tea, not wine. I lit the soft lamp near my desk and reopened my journal, the same one I'd started the day Ross Capitol was born. On a fresh page, I wrote. Chapter 8, they never counted on me. That was their mistake. I counted on myself. And they never stopped building. I closed the book. Outside, the city sparkled. Inside, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Diana. Just confirmed. Your profile will be featured on the cover of Time's annual Power issue. Their team says it's not just because of what you did. It's because of what it changed. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it. Not for validation, but for the journey. Because I had walked every step alone. Carried every silence. Absorbed every dismissal. And I did not just arrive here. I earned it. I had become the woman they never counted on. And I had built the future they could no longer ignore. Spring came late that year in Chicago. Snow lingered on the edges of rooftops while the lake thawed in slow, lazy sheets. But inside Ross Capitol's headquarters, everything moved with intention, a seamless rhythm of strategy, numbers, and momentum. And at the center of it all stood the vision I had designed long before anyone knew my name. It had been 4 months since the Anderson acquisition. 3 since Daniel resigned. 2 since Time published its Power issue with my silhouette cast in golden light against the skyline. The headline read, The woman who reshaped the market, quietly. But even that headline felt too small. Because it wasn't just the market I had changed. It was the rules of engagement. That morning, I entered the boardroom for a session with a new group of investors, young, diverse, and ready to back an ambitious initiative I had been quietly preparing. We called it Project Lattice. A venture capital ecosystem designed specifically to identify and fund women-led companies that had been overlooked by traditional firms. Most of the women we're targeting, I told the room, are not waiting for the world to discover them. They're too busy building. We're not investing in ideas. We're investing in momentum that already exists, it's just been ignored. The room nodded, pens scribbled, figures were adjusted. But the impact wasn't in the pitch deck. It was in the energy. The unspoken understanding that this was no longer a sidebar mission. It was the future. After the meeting, Diana pulled me aside. "You've become the standard," she said. "Boards are rewriting hiring policies because of you." I shook my head gently. They're doing it because they know they're late. I'm just the wake-up call. But even as my firm expanded, as my inbox flooded with interviews, invitations, and features, there was one letter that gave me pause. It arrived not by email, but in a white envelope, handwritten. The address was familiar. My old high school. Inside was a note from the headmaster. And beneath it, a stack of crayon drawings from the 10th grade girls' economics class. They had just finished a unit on business leadership. Each student had been asked to draw a leader they admire. One drawing showed a tall woman with a briefcase and a cape, standing on a mountain made of books. Another showed a smiling woman at a giant table with girls seated all around it, no men in sight, but every chair full. One simply said, in neat cursive letters, "I want to build like Elena Ross." I stared at them for a long time. Because I remembered being a 15-year-old girl with her head down, reading about mergers while the other students talked about dances and boyfriends. I remembered the teacher who once told me I was too intense and should focus more on being likable. I remembered the way Daniel had called me ambitious, but not intimidating, thank God. I folded the drawings carefully and placed them in my journal. The same one that had once held sketches of Ross Capital's first mock logo. The same one I'd carried to every acquisition meeting, every overnight strategy session, every deal negotiation. Later that week, at a private gala honoring women in finance, I gave a short speech. Just 3 minutes. No slides. No sound effects. I didn't start this journey with a plan to become a headline, I told them. I just wanted to be heard. And when I wasn't, I decided to speak in actions instead of arguments. Applause rose like thunder. After the event, as I walked through the lobby, I spotted someone I hadn't seen in years, Eric Bowman, my earliest mentor and one of the few men who had seen me clearly long before the spotlight ever found me. "You built a fortress," he said. "No," I replied. "I built a lighthouse. So others could see their way through." He smiled. "And now they will." That evening, in my office high above the city, I sat by the window, phone off, lights dim, tea cooling beside me. Across the street, a billboard flashed with a new campaign, Lattice, backing the builders who weren't invited to the table. The same street once lined with Daniel's advertisements. His name was gone now. Replaced by legacy. Mine. But I didn't smile in triumph. I breathed. I reflected. I prepared. Because I knew this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the next chapter, one that wouldn't be written by dismissal or arrogance or noise. It would be written by the women they overlooked. By the minds they silenced. By the ones who were told they were too much or not enough. And most of all, by the ones who learned to build quietly until the world finally turned to listen. The future was no longer an invitation. It was a blueprint. And I had drawn the first line. The elevator opened directly into my penthouse. The city was quiet that night, veiled in soft fog, as if holding its breath. I stepped inside, heels echoing softly on marble floors, the silence of the space greeting me like an old friend. On the glass dining table sat a box. I hadn't ordered anything. No label. No sender. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was an old fountain pen. Gold-plated. Engraved with initials, D.W. I recognized it instantly. It was Daniel's. The same pen he once claimed was his good luck charm, the one he used to sign all major deals, the one he once snatched from my hand during a charity event because he said it was too heavy for me. The one he refused to lend when I asked, years ago, to sign my first independent agreement. Beneath the pen was a note. Handwritten. Not typed. No legal letterhead. Just black ink on thick linen paper. I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just want you to know. I see it now. I see you. I should have seen you before. I should have stood beside you instead of above you. I should have learned from you instead of laughing at you. You didn't take anything from me. You built what I couldn't. And that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Daniel. I sat at the table for a moment, staring at the note. There was no anger left. No triumph. No satisfaction in his regret. Only a deep, resounding truth: I didn't need the return. Not of the pen. Not of the apology. Not of the man who once dismissed me in front of an entire room. Because I had already returned, to myself. To the woman I was before the noise. To the architect. The founder. The one who built without applause. That night, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago's silent skyline. The city looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because I had. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was from Diana. Senator Monroe just quoted you in her opening address at the Women in Power Summit. She said, we must stop waiting to be invited to the table, and instead build our own, just like Elena Ross did. I replied simply, let's send her a lattice packet. She'll love what we're building next. Because we were always building. Not for revenge. For legacy. The next morning, I found myself walking along the lake before dawn. No guards. No press. Just quiet steps, and air crisp enough to remind me I was alive. Near the old museum, I spotted a small bench, the kind where old thoughts find new shape. I sat down and closed my eyes. And for the first time in a long time, I thought of the beginning. Before Daniel. Before Ross Capital. Back when I was just a girl with a cracked leather journal, sketching company names on library tables, dreaming of offices and silence and strategy. That girl would be proud. Not because the world knew my name now. But because I never let them define it for me. Later that day, I placed Daniel's pen in a locked case, beside my original Ross Capital documents and the first drawing I'd made of the firm's logo. It would never be used again. Not as a tool. Not as a weapon. Only as a reminder. That the man who once refused to lend it had been replaced by a woman who never needed it in the first place. At the end of the week, Deanna handed me a folder. New proposal. Fast-growing firm out of Lisbon. All-female founders. Undercapitalized but brilliant. They're asking for a partner. And they asked for you by name. I smiled. Schedule a call. Let's hear what they're building. The path forward was clear. Not because I stood alone, but because I was no longer afraid to stand visible. I had never needed their permission. Only my own. And now, the next generation was watching. And building. And rising. With no need to return to the places that once denied them, because they were already past the gates. And this time, we were holding them open. Years passed. Not quickly, not loudly, but with purpose. The world kept turning, faster in some places, slower in others. But in the heart of it all, Ross Capital remained steady. Evolved. Rooted. Expanding like a tree that had once been planted in secret, now shading the next generation beneath its branches. By the 5th anniversary of the Anderson acquisition, the firm had grown into a global architecture of influence, not just financially, but philosophically. It wasn't only about who we funded. It was about how we did it. We had launched 4 international lattice hubs, Sao Paulo, Nairobi, Seoul, and Warsaw. Each staffed by women who had once been turned away, overlooked, or told they were too quiet for the room. We didn't teach them to be louder. We taught the world to listen better. One of our most successful partnerships came from a single mother in Jakarta who had invented a new biodegradable packaging method while working night shifts. Another, a 24-year-old coder from Morocco who developed a microloan blockchain for women's cooperatives. They weren't building for profit. They were building for survival. For community. And I had made them the priority. One afternoon, as I walked the corridor of our headquarters, now a redesigned space with open ceilings, curated art, and quiet meditation rooms, I passed the display wall outside the main boardroom. It featured a series of plaques. Companies founded and funded by Ross Capital, 2018 to 2029. Below them, another plaque simply read, "Built on patience. Engineered by underestimation." It was Diana's idea. She had also installed a small glass case nearby, the one that held the original Ross Capital logo sketch, the first signed check, and a small folded note in my own handwriting. Asterisk, you are not too much. You are exactly enough. Build quietly. They'll hear you eventually, asterisk. Every visitor who came through that hallway stopped to read it. They took photos. They whispered like they were in a cathedral. Because they knew they were standing in a space that had once existed only in defiance. Back in my private office, I sat down to record a personal video. It wasn't for the press. It wasn't for awards. It was for the Ross Capital Time Vault, a new initiative we started to preserve messages for future leaders. I looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this, I began, then maybe you've been told you don't belong here. That your ideas are too soft. That your voice doesn't carry enough weight. That you should stay quiet, stay humble, stay home. I paused. I want you to know something. The world does not hand out space. You take it. You build it. Even if no one claps. Especially if no one claps. Outside, the city glowed in the slow burn of twilight. I continued. There was a time I sat at tables where people laughed when I spoke. Where I was introduced as someone's wife, not someone's equal. I used to think I had to prove myself. Now I understand, I only had to remember who I already was. The red recording light blinked gently. The lens saw me clearly. And I let it. The most powerful people I've ever met weren't the loudest. They were the ones who chose silence as strategy. Stillness as strength. And when they finally moved, they changed everything. I ended the recording and saved the file. Labeled it to the next builder. Outside my window, the Ross Capital name gleamed in soft gold lettering across the adjacent tower. A name that had once belonged to nothing more than a quiet dream. A dream dismissed by most. Believed by few. Carried by one. Me. That evening, I returned to my penthouse for a dinner I hadn't had in years, alone, by choice. A single place setting. My favorite pasta. A glass of Italian red. No noise. No guests. Just presence. I opened the leather journal that had traveled with me through every season. I turned to a fresh page. And I wrote. Asterisk legacy is not what they say when you're gone. It's what you build when they're not watching. It's what survives after the noise dies down. It's the silence that speaks for you, asterisk. As the lights dimmed across the skyline and the city folded itself into evening, I closed the book gently. The chapter was complete. Not because I'd said everything, but because now, others were ready to speak. And they no longer needed permission. They only needed a blueprint. A path once written in silence. Now carved in stone.